This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Hello, my name is Tim Lynch and I'm the convener of 10 Great Books at Melbourne Masterclass. I'd like to start our Zoomed Masterclass today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm filming from, the Dudja Wurrung people, and paying my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'm filming from Clunes, Victoria, Booktown. Unfortunately, there is no book festival this year because of the lockdown, but I'm delighted to be leading a masterclass on one of the most important books ever written from the premier Booktown in Australia. You're all very, very welcome to this masterclass. The process, as it was in the previous session, is that our speaker will address us for upwards of an hour. And then afterwards, I will lead a Q&A and use some of the many excellent questions that the group has submitted. And we'll look to wrap after about an hour and a half or so of filming. Your comments have been absolutely crucial. Your feedback to the first recording has helped us refine how we've gone about doing things this time around. And we're delighted that so many people have responded positively to this compensating version of the masterclass. But I will add that we're all very, very keen to see you again in the forum, face to face, when the craziness has all ended. It's my great delight to be able to introduce David McInnis to you today. David is Associate Professor of Shakespeare and Early Modern Drama at the University of Melbourne. He's got a productivity which rivals William Shakespeare's. In 2020, he will be responsible for 4 important pieces of work: a monograph, Shakespeare and Lost Plays with Cambridge, a scholarly edition of Decker's Old Futunitas for the Revels play series with Manchester, and 2 edited collections, Loss and the Literary Culture of Shakespeare's Time with Palgrave, and Tamburlaine, a critical reader, part of the Arden Early Modern Drama Guides. In 2016, David was jointly awarded the Australian Academy of the Humanities Max Crawford Medal, granted to Australian early career researchers for outstanding scholarly achievement in the humanities. His work has been featured in the New York Times, in the Guardian, in the BBC, and elsewhere. This is David's second Great Book Masterclass. In 2014, he offered a brilliant assessment of King Lear. It is my great delight to be able to welcome David McInnis to the Zoom floor for our next masterclass. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me on this masterclass on Shakespeare's Hamlet. This is a play that is in many ways unexpectedly relevant all of a sudden. It's a play that, like its protagonist, is caught between competing impulses, situated as it is at the crossroads of the old and the new, the past and the future, but also importantly, the political and the personal. This is a play that holds these binaries not so much in a state of suspended animation, but animated suspension. The tragedy of Hamlet's inability to act is also his virtue of not rushing headlong into a dangerous course of action. He is an impossible ideal in many ways. He must simultaneously play the role of student, philosopher prince, son, and revenger, contemplative yet decisive, emotional yet rational, personal yet political, solipsistic yet a leader. We need only look around the world at political leaders of our own day struggling to cope with the challenges of the coronavirus to see Hamlet's predicament. He's being caught between these competing impulses. This plays out in our own world right now. As we come together to consider Shakespeare's great meditation on a world in flux, the imminent collapse of political orders, the ushering out of the old and the opportunism of the ruthless, we are once again confronted with the tension between public life, the public good, and the intensely personal experience of the calamity that surrounds us. So why Hamlet? Shakespeare's mature tragedies, like Hamlet, rest on the premise that people are in themselves pathetic enough, in the sense of pathos, to sustain a tragic action without the need for a conventional appeal to fate or fortune, which was of course the case in Romeo and Juliet with the star-crossed lovers. Fate is no longer as integral to tragedy as character when Shakespeare is writing Hamlet around the turn of the century. The central appeal of Shakespearean tragedy lies in human behaviour rather than in the external and uncontrollable action of events. The psychological interiority of the Hamlet character arguably represents Shakespeare's single greatest achievement in his stage adaptation of the Hamlet story and his contribution to the revenge tragedy mode. In a book called Hamlet versus Lear, a fascinating book that charts the rise and fall of Hamlet's popularity, Reg Folks cites a number of luminaries who espouse the greatness of Shakespeare's Hamlet up until around World War II. For John Keble, Hamlet was the noblest and greatest of all tragedies. For Victor Hugo, other works of the human mind equal Hamlet, none surpasses it. Alfred Lord Tennyson thought that Hamlet was the greatest creation in literature that I know of, and John Dover Wilson said that Hamlet is the greatest of popular dramas. Ernest Jones finally says that the play is almost universally considered to be the chief masterpiece of one of the greatest minds the world has ever known. I'll return briefly at the end of the seminar to why King Lear may have replaced Hamlet in the popular vote for the title of Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, but I think this important selection of quotations helps illustrate just how highly regarded Shakespeare's tragedy has been, at least until the mid-20th century. As one of my former colleagues here, John Froese, suggests, perhaps the archetypal character in Western literature is the figure of Hamlet, a figure that has been taken as the initiator of modern inwardness, explored for motive and for its absence, and abstracted from the play Hamlet or placed firmly back within its various versions and its multiplicity of contexts. It's this playfulness of Hamlet, the fact that you can do so much with him, that makes it so exciting. The great director Michael Bogdanov once famously said, "You'll never see two actors doing Hamlet precisely the same way, even with precisely the same script, because Shakespeare leaves so much unsaid, so many gaps in that text, that room for interpretation and reimagining. It's ultimately flexible." This seems to have been recognized in Shakespeare's own time too, for in an exceptionally rare example of a contemporary commentator writing about one of Shakespeare's plays, the scholar Gabriel Harvey notes that the younger sort take much delight in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, but his Lucrece and his tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, have in it that to please the wiser sort. These notes appear to have been penned in the early years of the 1600s, making them pretty much exactly contemporary with Shakespeare's play. Something quite extraordinary here is that an English commercial play, the kind of thing that Thomas Bodley explicitly excluded from his Bodleian Library at Oxford and described as riffraff, unworthy of serious attention, an English commercial play was being given precisely the kind of serious attention by a learned scholar at the turn of the century. Hamlet was being singled out to occupy a place alongside the poetic masterpieces of Spenser, Chaucer, and others. Interesting too is that Shakespeare is apparently capable of broad appeal, pleasing both the younger sort and the wiser. His early poem, Venus and Adonis, was actually his most popular work in print, having been published 10 times by the time of Shakespeare's death in 1616. Something most people don't realise is just how freakish it is that Shakespeare's plays survive at all. Only a single page of the first edition of 1 Henry IV survives. Only one copy of the first edition of Titus Andronicus survives, and it was found in a Swedish cottage in the early 1900s. And no one knew that Hamlet had first been printed in 1603 until a copy turned up halfway through the 19th century. The printers of that first edition of Hamlet, the notorious First Quarto, recognised the literary qualities that Gabriel Harvey recognised as pleasing the wiser sort. Those printers chose to mark passages in the play that were particularly philosophical or quotable, as, for example, the advice that Laertes' father, here named Carambus, not Polonius, gives his son. "This, above all, to thine own self be true." You can see the quotation marks in the margins here for lines, for passages that are deemed quotable, quote-worthy. Part of Hamlet's appeal is his very fallibility too. He's far from being perfect. The fact that he has the weight of expectations on his shoulders, but is unable to fulfill his destiny. As Folk says, if Hamlet, with all his or Shakespeare's accomplishments of mind, was usually seen as weak, overwhelmed by events, or unable to act and achieve his goal of revenge, he could serve as both a paradigm of and excuse for ordinary people who in the normal way regard themselves as having potential, but fail to live up to their ideal of themselves or fall short of the achievements they hope for. So here we have this aristocratic philosophical prince character who nevertheless remains very relatable for the everyday person, precisely because of his failings rather than his achievements. A clue to what was most memorable about Shakespeare's play comes from this obscure document I found in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC. I'm still working on dating the manuscript. It's an entire book written by hand with no author's name and no date, and a paper stock, which is hard to identify, but it's possibly as early as 1600 and certainly 17th century more generally. And I think it may just be the earliest, or at least one of the earliest recorded references to Shakespeare's play. I'll just blow up the relevant part here. The thing that this author remembers from Shakespeare's play is indecision, hesitation. He says, as the revengeful Dane in the tragedy would not take his uncle's life while he made devotions. So if you were to pick the most memorable scene of all of Shakespeare's Hamlet, what would it be? Possibly not this one, but here we are, the moment when Claudius is at prayer. Hamlet has the chance to kill him, but decides not to do so in case he unwittingly sends his uncle's soul to heaven instead of hell. Hamlet may well be the first Shakespeare play to have been performed outside of Europe, if we believe the East India Company official William Keeling, whose diary entry for September 1607, whilst his ship, the Red Dragon, was off the coast of Africa at Sierra Leone, reads, "We had the tragedy of Hamlet." Either later that month, or maybe a bit later altogether, he apparently saw the play again when he wrote, "I had Hamlet acted aboard me, which I permit to keep my people from idleness and unlawful games or sleep." The status of these entries is somewhat disputed, with some critics claiming they're forgeries, or at least unverifiable. But the proposition that Hamlet would be played outside the Anglophone world is very attractive. Certainly, a version of Hamlet was also being performed in Germany, in German, by the 1620s. So to answer Catherine Smith's question for me in the seminar, which was, given Hamlet's position today in the Western canon, how was it received at the time of first performances and how did it come to achieve the status it has today? Dimity Reed and Gary Joslin asked a version of this question too. Well, here we have Gabriel Harvey's selection display for pleasing the wiser sort. We have performances off the coast of Africa and in Germany, as we'll see shortly, performances in London and multiple print editions. So this is obviously quite a well-received play, an important play, even from the very early days. Now I want to think about the early context for Shakespeare's play for a minute. This is a screenshot from my research project, the Lost Plays Database, which documents all the information we have about plays that were once written and performed during Shakespeare's lifetime, but which for various reasons haven't survived to the present, including a lost Hamlet play that was written and performed well before Shakespeare's version. We know quite a bit about this lost play. We know, of course, that Shakespeare didn't invent the story of Hamlet, and this early play shows that his audiences would have known it quite well. This play, referred to by critics as the Ur-Hamlet, or the original Hamlet, was staged as early as 1589, more than a decade before Shakespeare's play. And we know this from Thomas Nash's reference in that year to a Hamlet play in his criticism of Senecan-style tragedy. He says, "Yet English Seneca, read by candlelight, yields many good sentences, as blood is a beggar, and so forth. And if you entreat him fair in a frosty morning, he will afford you whole Hamlets, I should say handfuls of tragical speeches." 5 years later, in 1594, the manager of the Rose Theatre, Philip Henslowe, recorded a performance of a play called Hamlet in his diary that year as well, around about the middle of the entries on the screen here. So we know this old Hamlet play was being performed publicly. Finally, in 1596, we have Thomas Lodge's reference to a ghost who cries so miserably at the theatre like an oyster wife, which is to say very shrilly, Hamlet, revenge. So this play obviously made quite an impression. People are very familiar with the Hamlet story on stage before we get to Shakespeare. And I want to turn now briefly to Helen Molnar's question for me in the seminar, which is, what is the significance of setting the play in Denmark? Location is important in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, where the locals are called drunkards by other nations, and where one may smile and be a villain. Laertes reluctantly returns to Denmark from France, where he enjoys greater freedom, though his father takes care to prescribe his behaviours whilst abroad, and even surveys his son's foreign activities for good measure. And to the melancholic prince, Denmark is a prison. The Elsinore of Shakespeare's Hamlet is also, of course, a foil for Elizabethan London, as Stephen Mullany and numerous others have observed. Its crisis of succession eerily refracting fin de siècle English concerns. Our perception of early modern drama has, however, been distorted by venerating Shakespeare alone. And within the Shakespearean canon, Hamlet tends to be singled out for importance. But an early modern playgoer's conception of Denmark and the Danes on stage would not have been derived solely from Shakespeare. And I would argue that Hamlet is better thought of as participating in a kind of Danish matrix alongside such lost plays as that anonymous Hamlet, performed much earlier on, The Tanner of Denmark, performed by the Lord Stranger's Men in 1592, a play called Kutlak in 1594, which probably focused on Gutlak, the king of the Danes, and the two-part Earl Godwin plays, which were depicting Godwin's service on behalf of Denmark during King Canut's reign and the subsequent anti-Danish sentiment of Edward's reign. And so I want to have a quick look at these last couple in particular, just to give you a sense of what did Shakespeare's audiences understand Denmark to mean on stage. So in the spring to summer of 1598, the Admiral's Men, a rival playing company, performed two plays about Earl Godwin and his sons. Playgoers in London would already have seen a play that does still survive in manuscript, called Edmund Ironside, which ends with a duel between Edmund and King Canute. And that ends amicably. They shake hands in the end and agree to disagree. In the Earl Godwin plays, the subject matter takes place in the generation after those events. When King Canute finally dies, his sons, Harold and Hardy Canute, become kings of England and Denmark respectively. But when Harold dies, the Danish Hardy Canute becomes king of England too. So one man, king of both Denmark and England. He too reigns briefly and becomes the last Danish king of England. Although the potential successors include Alfred and Edward, his sons-in-laws, the English Earl Godwin also staked a claim to the throne. Owing to his military exploits on behalf of Denmark against Norway, Godwin had previously been in great favour with King Canute and had even married Canute's sister. Seeing a claim to the throne for his own family, he intercepts Alfred and Edward as they prepare to return to England, and he kills Alfred. Edward survives. Edward becomes Edward the Confessor. When the lords of England learn of Godwin's treachery, they determine that he should be put to death. But by this stage, Godwin has already fled to Denmark, where he remains for more than 4 years. So in this Earl of Godwin story then, Denmark's fate is closely entwined with England's. Godwin's service on behalf of the Danes places his sons in line for the English throne. And when events take a turn for the worse, Denmark becomes a place of refuge for Godwin. Edward the Confessor's reign is characterised by anti-Danish sentiment. As a king, he is notably an Englishman and famed for discharging the Englishmen from the great tribute called Danegeld, a taxation imposed by the Danes. Godwin, though, straddles the national divide, embracing both Denmark and England. And when he finally falls out of favour with Edward the Confessor and dies, you'll remember that your Norman history, Edward eventually names Godwin's son, Harold, the successor. And it's Harold who is vanquished by William the Conqueror. So we're right up to 1066 now, and in this pre-Norman moment, you can see how the fates of England and Denmark are very closely intertwined. So much so that I would argue that in this pre-Norman era, Denmark is figured almost as England's uncanny other. England resists Danish rule, it resents Danish influence, but the two countries' fortunes are interlinked at various points of succession crisis. Englishness is seemingly depicted through emergence from a Danish shadow via direct engagement with the Danish challenge. It's only after all these Danish-themed plays of the 1590s that we arrive finally at the Globe Theatre and Shakespeare's Hamlet at the turn of the century. Throughout the 1590s, Shakespeare had specialised in comedies and histories, his Henry V being perhaps the first of his plays staged at the Globe at the end of the decade. Hamlet, if you've been following my argument, can be seen as a kind of English history play, precisely because Denmark and England are so intertwined in the popular imaginary. Hamlet might be the culmination of the Tudor history plays, the first and second tetralogies, that Shakespeare spent the 1590s crafting. Shakespeare's Hamlet is also indebted to the Romance tradition that was so popular during Elizabeth's reign. Romance, as M.H. Abrahams explains it, is distinguished from the epic. So we're thinking the knights questing for the Holy Grail is a great example of epic. Romance is distinguished from epic in that it does not represent a heroic age of tribal wars, but a courtly and chivalric age, often one of highly developed manners and civility. Its standard plot is that of a quest undertaken by a single knight in order to gain a lady's favour. Frequently, its central interest is courtly love, together with tournaments fought and dragons and monsters slain for the damsel's sake. It stresses the chivalric ideals of courage, loyalty, honour, mercifulness to an opponent, and elaborate manners, and it delights in wonders and marvels. Supernatural events in the epic had their causes in the will and actions of the gods. Romance shifts the supernatural to this world and makes much of the mysterious effect of magic, spells, and enchantments. And so for all our thinking of Hamlet as being a very forward-looking play, a proto-modern play, it's also very clearly steeped in the recent past, in the genre of romance that was popular in the 1590s. Here are just a few examples of romance motifs that affect the way Shakespeare's Hamlet is produced. There's a specific movement away from the epic. There's an anti-epic moment with the first player's speech, the tale of Aeneas being told to Dido about the rugged Pyrrhus. Comedy and tragedy engage with one of romance's defining characteristics, idealism, either through the realization of an ideal in comedy or through frustration or loss of an ideal in tragedy. And of course, Shakespeare's Hamlet is all about that loss of the past, of the former ideal, the glory days of old Hamlet being on the throne. That is the precondition for Shakespeare's play existing. We even have old Hamlet's ghost appearing in armour, a sign of chivalry, of the old world that no longer exists, that no longer is effective in the present, in the real world. And it culminates in single combat between Hamlet and Laertes, that very old-fashioned, gentlemanly pursuit, that noble code of conduct in which they settle their differences. And yet at the same time, the play exhibits a sustained interest in melancholia, which is a hallmark of Jacobean writing, looks forward to the reign of James rather than back to the romance of Elizabeth. Shakespeare's play exudes an aura of melancholy from the opening scene. At the dead hour, the sentinel Francisco is sick at heart with a causeless melancholy, which foreshadows Hamlet's disposition. Hamlet, from his first appearance, is dressed in nighted colour and an inky cloak, a significant factor contributing to general malaise, given that colour symbolism was universal throughout the Renaissance, black being used to represent gloom or evil or death. Also from his first appearance, Hamlet's almost monomaniac obsession with death is evident, from his extended mourning and his desire for self-slaughter to his compulsion to examine skulls in a graveyard. Claudius begins his speech with discussion of his dear brother's death and proceeds to reveal that Norway is also in the throes of death, the king, Fortinbras's uncle, being described as impotent and bedrid. And Gertrude too immediately continues the morbid theme, reminding Hamlet that all that lives must die. In no small part, this ubiquitous manifestation of melancholy is a reflection of England's cultural malaise at the century's end, generated by the gloomy prospects facing the heirless nation and the concerns over the effects potentially arising from the selection of an inappropriate successor for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, had died without naming an heir. Anxieties over England's political future were rife with the approach of Elizabeth's death and her refusal to name an heir in the absence of any children of her own. Interestingly then, melancholia was in many ways a product of Elizabethan England, though it defined much of the literature of James's rule. Consider Hamlet's allusion to the mildewed ear of Pharaoh's dream, Genesis 41. Look you now what follows. Here is your husband like a mildewed ear, blasting his wholesome brother. That's from Act 3, Scene 4. Presumably this reference to the thin and blighted ears of grain swallowing up the plump and full ears resonates with Elizabethan concerns over the dangers posed by the possibility of misrule in the absence of a named and legitimate heir. When Elizabeth did die, we hear reports from around London of bonfires being lit and the English celebrating the death of the Queen and the fact that they now have a king ruling them at long last. The French ambassador, and André Hurault, notes the sentiments of the English nobility as a whole. He says the English would never again submit to the rule of a woman. The tragic history of Denmark has a purchase on the present, providing examples to warn contemporary English audiences of the dangerous prospects which they may face. Thus, the primary concerns of succession and the degeneration of the state remain central to both the play and Elizabethan interests. And perhaps it isn't so different in our own time too, this kind of political misogyny. It's not surprising, in light of all this, that Hamlet develops a mistrust of women in general. Clearly, this mistrust is nothing but a projection of Hamlet's misogynist anxieties. His declaration, "Frailty, thy name is woman," generalizes out from the particular case of his mother's incestuous remarriage to the sexuality of women everywhere. This misogyny, of course, becomes misdirected towards the chaste Ophelia later on in the nunnery scene, where he again generalizes that nothing but ill can come from female sexuality. This concern over the changing of the guard also contributes to modern readings of Hamlet as a political play, depicting the struggle between feudalism and modernity, a view espoused by Brecht and others. Claudius, of course, is the keenest to get to the root of Hamlet's madness and identify its cause, for he suspects something is up. Accordingly, he solicits the services of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to assess Hamlet's transformation, or so he calls it, since the exterior nor the inward man resembles that it was. Claudius says, what it should be more than his father's death, that has thus put him so much from the understanding of himself I cannot deem of. I entreat you both, that being of so young days brought up with him, and since so neighboured to his youth and humour, that you vouchsafe your rest here in our court some little time. So by your companies to draw him on to pleasures, and to gather so much as from occasions you may glean, whether aught to us unknown afflicts him thus, that opened lies within our remedy. Gertrude similarly employs Hamlet's classmates to seek the company of her too much changed son. Polonius sees love melancholy as the source of Hamlet's madness, though an overprotective paternal impulse may lie behind his concern. When Ophelia, who has just encountered a wild Hamlet while sewing in her closet, tells her father of the events that have just transpired, he interprets Hamlet's actions in terms of being mad for thy love. This is the very ecstasy of love, whose violent property foredoes itself, he says. Without pausing to give any further thought to the matter, Polonius asserts that Ophelia's repulsion of Hamlet and refusal of his letters hath made him mad, and rushes to tell the king and queen, I do think that I have found the very cause of Hamlet's lunacy. Excited by the prospect of gaining certain knowledge of Hamlet's condition, yet simultaneously fearing the risk of his crime being exposed, Claudius cautiously expresses pleasure at Polonius's news. He tells me, my sweet queen, that he hath found the head and source of all your son's distemper. It's only Gertrude who senses what is palpably obvious to the audience. I doubt it is no other but the main, his father's death and our over-hasty marriage. Claudius, however, remains sceptical. Well, we shall sift him, he says. And Polonius is adamant that unrequited love is the stem of Hamlet's sadness. He proudly reports, and then I precept gave her, Ophelia, that she should lock herself from his resort, admit no messengers, receive no tokens, which done, she took the fruits of my advice, and he, repulsed, a short tale to make, fell into a sadness, then into a fast, then into a watch, thence to a weakness, thence to a lightness, and by this declension into the madness wherein now he raves, and all we wail for. And despite the failed attempts by Polonius and Claudius to prove that the origin and commencement of grief sprung from neglected love, we see in the graveyard scene that there may be some truth to this theory after all. Here's Hamlet now. What I've done that might your nature, honour and exception roughly awake, I here proclaim was madness. So here he's talking to Laertes, and here he's throwing off his cover in one sense, but he's also being a little bit disingenuous, I think. He says, was it Hamlet who wronged Laertes? Never Hamlet. If Hamlet from himself be taken away, and when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies him. This is the early modern equivalent of, I was drunk when I did it, so it's not my fault. Who does it then? His madness? If it be so, Hamlet is of the faction that was wronged. His madness is poor Hamlet's enemy. So we're seeing a really interesting tension here between madness and melancholia. The madness registers locally, personally, on the body. It may be genuine, or perhaps it's feigned. We can't quite tell. It's related to melancholia, which is a physical imbalance of the four bodily humours that the Greek physician Galen thought made up the human body. Hamlet is seen to have an excess of black bile, which produces a melancholic disposition in his character. But melancholy is also a cultural trait, as I've been arguing. It's something experienced collectively by Elizabethan England at the turn of the century as they're dreading the fate of their country, with their once beloved queen refusing to name an heir and guarantee safety and stability for England after she dies. So we're seeing a very close relationship between the personal and the political, the private and the public playing out. And it's that tension that makes the play. It's not a speedy resolution. This is not an epic or a quest where you go from A to B, where you seek the Holy Grail and you find the Holy Grail. Instead, this is a romance mode of writing. It's governed by digression, by hesitation, by a multiplicity of different mini storylines and distractions rather than a linear quest from A to B. Of course, we focus on Hamlet's madness a great deal, and we think about the ramifications of Hamlet's madness, or his embodiment of grief and melancholia, in terms of the state that he represents as a prince. While Hamlet gets most of the lines and attention, at least on paper, his feigned madness and genuine melancholy are contrasted in the play with the genuine madness of his shunned and abused lover, the poor Ophelia. So madness becomes gendered, melancholia becomes gendered in this play too. How a production handles Ophelia's feminine form of madness is significant. A director can reproduce Hamlet's misogyny by downplaying the significance of Ophelia's plight or giving limited airtime to her degeneration. They can depict her through stereotype as hysterical. The word refers to a wandering womb, a bodily imbalance supposedly experienced by mad women. But I'd like to share with you now one of my favourite depictions of Ophelia. This production of Hamlet was directed by Melbourne Uni alumna and truly Felicia King. Felicia's original plays White Pearl, Slaughterhouse and Golden Shield premiered at Royal Court London, Belvoir Street Theatre and Sydney Theatre Company, and the Melbourne Theatre Company, all in 2019. And she's recently won the American Shakespeare Centre's prestigious Shakespeare's New Contemporaries Award, which sees her latest play, Kean, being read at the Blackfriars Playhouse in Stanton, Virginia. So I'm going to show you now the moment of Ophelia's madness in Felicia King's version of Hamlet. This is a resource we filmed for my second year subject using Melbourne Uni Shakespeare Company actors. I'd use this to teach with the blended learning approach that we have in Shakespeare in Performance. So it's the scene depicting Ophelia's madness, Act 4, Scene 5, just an excerpt of it.
I will not speak with her.
She is importunate, indeed distract, her mood will needs be pitied.
What would she have?
Her speech is nothing, yet the unshaped use of it doth move the hearers to collection. They aim at it, and botch the words up fit to their own thoughts, which as her winks, and nods, and gestures yield them, indeed would make one think there might be thought, though nothing sure, yet much unhappily.
'Twere good she were spoken with, for she may strew dangerous conjectures in ill-breeding minds. Let her come in.
is the beauteous majesty of Denmark?
Why, how now, Ophelia?
How should I your true love know from another one? By his cockle hat and staff, and his sandal shoon.
Alas, sweet lady, what imports this song?
Say you? Nay, pray you, mark, she is dead and gone, lady. She is dead and gone. At her head, a grass-green turf. At her heels, a stone.
Alas, look here, my lord.
Lauded with sweet flowers, which bewept to the grave did go, with true love showers.
How do you, pretty lady?
Well, good ill due. They say the owl was a baker's daughter. Lord, we know what we are, but know not what we may be.
Conceit upon her mother.
Indeed. Without oath, I'll make end on it. By just and by Saint Charity, alack and fight for shame. Young men will do it if they come to it. By cock, they are to blame. Quoth she, before you tumbled me, you promised me to wed. So would I done by yonder sun. And thou hadst not come to my bed.
How long hath she been thus?
I hope all will be well. We must be patient. But I cannot choose but weep. To think they should lay her in the cold ground. My brother shall know of it. So, I thank you for your good counsel. Come, my coach. Come.
I find this incredibly moving production, actually. These are all student actors, and Seren, who played Ophelia in particular, is just extraordinarily fragile in this scene. The gravitas that she brings to the role, the way Felicia King has framed this extended silence, you find yourself almost holding your breath the whole way through, and just Ophelia dominates your attention. She's absolutely central, and though her lines are fewer than Hamlet's in the play, she regains absolute centrality here. And we actually feel just how tragic her downfall is, this genuine madness that has been produced through Hamlet's actions, his disturbing actions, his disregard for her. I think it's a really wonderful production, and these actors did an amazing job, I think. Perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, we're moving to the final part of the seminar now. I want to think a little bit more about Memento Mori, that famous alas, poor Yorick moment. Perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, the incident with Yorick's skull is not an instance of melancholy. Arguably, the quintessential image of Hamlet is the one which is here modelled by David Tennant, Hamlet with a skull, contemplating death. Even a cartoon outline of this pose is enough to send many people pronouncing in their most actorly voice, to be or not to be, that is the question. The trouble is, Hamlet doesn't have a skull in his hand during the to be or not to be speech. The skull comes from the graveyard and Ophelia's burial, and it belongs to Yorick. Neither is Hamlet alone when he contemplates Yorick's skull, though you wouldn't know it from the numerous photographs, movie stills, promotional materials, and even cartoons depicting this moment. He has to be alone when we recall this moment, because our image of him is as the constantly introspective prince who delays revenge by thinking too precisely on the event. Hamlet isn't alone when he delivers the to be or not to be speech either, by the way. Ophelia is on stage throughout, and Polonius and Claudius are known to be overhearing it by the audience. As the ardent Shakespeare editors note, the mental picture we all seem to have of Hamlet, which is Hamlet alone on stage, is actually realised rather less often than one might think, though some theatrical conventions of act and scene division have tended to emphasise it. There is certainly some deep meditation going on in the graveyard scene, though interestingly, it's not as solipsistic and inward-looking as it might be. Hamlet returns from his imposed exile in England in time to inadvertently witness Ophelia's burial. In Shakespeare's sources, Hamlet returns in time to witness his own funeral rites being performed, the Claudius character assuming that Hamlet was killed in England as per the sealed orders. That Shakespeare chose not to exploit the rich potential of this situation, in which the protagonist is confronted with an image of his own death, is, I think, significant. If Shakespeare had intended to emphasise Hamlet's solipsism, this seems to be quite the missed opportunity. Hamlet's not overthinking his revenge in the graveyard scene, but he is overthinking something. He's fixated on death, and not simply his own. If you look at this part of the scene where he's holding the skull and he's talking about Alexander the Great and all these other people who have died and turned to dust, you'll see that coming to terms with his own mortality is central here. As Roland Fry has shown, the Renaissance was schooled in the contemplation of death. Hamlet here muses on the fact that death is universal and unavoidable. Even the greatest of emperors are subject to it in the end. It's the great leveller, and as he'd earlier implied in the context of Polonius's body, a king may go a progress through the guts of a beggar. Profound as all this may sound to us now, though it also bears the burden of a cliche, thanks to innumerable repetitions in the classroom, this kind of thought would not have singled Hamlet out as an especially deep thinker to an Elizabethan audience. The contemplation of a skull is hardly radical by the time of Hamlet. Possibly the most famous example is Hans Holbein's anamorphic portrait, The Ambassadors, executed in 1533 or thereabouts. This picture, now in the National Gallery in London, depicts two Frenchmen on a diplomatic visit to England, here pictured at Westminster Abbey. Interpretive possibilities of the symbolic objects and technologies surrounding the men are rife, but it's the dramatic slash or slashed blur in the foreground which occupies volumes of print in library shelves. Take a look at it now, it's on the very bottom. The picture literally changes as you move across the field of vision, hence its designation as an anamorphic portrait. The issue of perspective is central here. The physical, literal perspective is extended by metaphor to describe the necessity of having the right perspective on life and death. Death is not seen as something to be feared necessarily. It's a constant spectre hanging over our little lives, an unavoidable endpoint that we do well to remember. Such memento mori images were frequently accompanied with epithetic tags along the lines of, "I was once as you are now," spoken from the skull's point of view, obviously. The constant reminder that we too will come to dust is a motivation to lead a good, full, usually Christian life. Throughout Europe, mirrors, dressing tables, and jewelry had such motifs carved into them. The misogyny of Shakespeare's play is perhaps to be expected, given the fin de siècle anxieties over the passing of Elizabeth's reign and its final prolonged state of degeneracy. But in the graveyard scene, at least, there may be nothing misogynist about Hamlet's sentiments. It's true that he doesn't yet know that Ophelia is dead, that he's about to witness her burial, that his advice to the skull to tell his lady that she will come to this no matter how much makeup she applies is ironically more apt than he can know. But in the memento mori tradition, reminding his lady of the transitoriness of beauty and the inevitability of aging and death is good advice, not sexist slander. Serious contemplation, not extreme emotional states or anxiety, was occasioned by the confrontation with the skull. In fact, it's that debate, that confrontation and the indecision, but also the weighing of different sides, which makes Shakespeare's Hamlet as a character so important to think. As Ruth Lunny from Newcastle has observed, 400 years after they first appeared on the stage, we are still asking why about Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and Shakespeare's Macbeth and Hamlet, even when we accept as more or less transparent the character and motives of a host of other personages. She gives examples like Titus Andronicus, Hieronymo, Barabbas, or Richard III. Those figures are certainly distinctive and memorable, but it's their deeds and dilemmas that we question, not any intrinsic nature they might possess. Debatable characters, as Lunny calls them, on the other hand, still attract contesting opinions, informed by our own individual powers of observation and notions of psychology. So why did Hamlet do what he did? Not just should he do it or shouldn't he do it? And so I want to leave you then with Reg Folks again, and I promised I would come back to why King Lear has seemed to become more important than Hamlet now after centuries of Hamlet's ascendancy. Folks argues that Lear has come to seem richly significant in political terms, in a world in which old men have held on to and abused power, often in corrupt or arbitrary ways. And he's thinking particularly post-Holocaust and post-World War II, and that absolute nihilism that makes sense in King Lear after those events, but was too much for the world to contemplate before that. In the same period, Hamlet has lost much of its political relevance, as liberal intellectuals have steadily been marginalised in Britain and the United States. I might want to think about whether the time has come for those fortunes to be reversed now, whether we've had enough of these old men in power, and whether it is time to trust experts, to trust those who are philosophical, who are deep thinkers, who actually can understand the world around them and offer meaningful advice again, or whether we are still playing to the egos of those in power. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I haven't gone on too long. It's very hard to limit what one gets to say about a play as rich and wonderful and detailed as Shakespeare's Hamlet in all its different early versions. But ultimately, I guess the final lines have to go to Hamlet himself. The rest is silence.